Number 1. Terry Lynn Nichols. There's a quiet kind of evil that hides in plain sight. The kind that blends into a small-town life, smiles at neighbors, and still believes that chaos can somehow fix the world. Terry Lynn Nichols was one of those people, an ordinary man who became part of one of the deadliest acts ever committed on American soil. Born in Lapeer, Michigan in 1955, Terry Nichols was the second of 4 children in a working-class family. Those who knew him described him as shy, polite, even soft-spoken. He had an interest in self-reliance, distrust of authority, and a fascination with survivalist ideas, traits that would later find darker company. After high school, Nichols drifted from job to job, working as a carpenter, and later joining the U.S. Army. That's where he met another soldier, Timothy McVeigh, a man whose rage against the government would shape the rest of Nichols' life. Their bond grew around shared frustrations, distrust of the federal government, anger over gun control, and outrage over events like the 1993 Waco siege. Nichols, already disillusioned after a failed marriage and mounting debts, became increasingly obsessed with the idea that America's government had turned into a tyrant. McVeigh's extremism gave that anger direction. Together, they decided to strike back, not with words, but with explosives. In 1994, Nichols began helping McVeigh gather the ingredients for a bomb. They bought hundreds of pounds of fertilizer, stockpiled ammonium nitrate, and mixed it with fuel oil. The same materials farmers used for crops, now turned into a weapon. Nichols rented storage units under fake names, purchased detonators, and kept detailed notes. To outsiders, it looked like harmless farm work. In reality, they were building one of the largest homemade bombs ever assembled on U.S. soil. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh parked a rented Ryder truck outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. Inside that truck sat the 4,800-pound bomb that he and Nichols had spent months preparing. At 9:02 a.m., it exploded with devastating force. The front half of the building collapsed, cars ignited for blocks, and a plume of smoke rose that could be seen for miles. The blast killed 168 people, including 19 children who were in a daycare center, and injured hundreds more. It remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. Nichols wasn't there that morning. He had stayed behind in Kansas, but every detail of the plan bore his fingerprints: the chemicals, the timers, the storage, the tools. When the FBI traced receipts and rental records, Nichols' name came up again and again. Within 2 days, agents arrived at his home in Harrington, Kansas. Nichols didn't resist. He turned himself in quietly, insisting he hadn't known what McVeigh was going to do. But investigators quickly uncovered bomb-making materials in his garage, maps, and letters, linking him directly to the conspiracy. The investigation grew into one of the largest in U.S. history. Thousands of agents, lab technicians, and forensic analysts pieced together fragments from the blast site, twisted metal, vehicle parts, and traces of fertilizer that all led back to the 2 men. McVeigh would later describe Nichols as his co-pilot, the one who helped make it all possible. The public's horror turned to outrage when court documents revealed that Nichols had stored materials used to kill dozens of children. The evidence left no doubt. This wasn't a man caught in a misunderstanding. It was a man who helped wage war against his own country. Nichols' first trial came in 1997 on federal charges. He was found guilty of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter for the federal officers who died in the blast. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. But Oklahoma wanted more. In 2004, the state charged him separately with 161 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each civilian victim. The trial lasted 4 months. Jurors listened to days of testimony about how he and McVeigh built the bomb, where they tested it, and how close they came to being discovered. Nichols showed little emotion throughout. The jury deadlocked on the death penalty, so the judge handed down 161 consecutive life sentences, one after another, symbolically ensuring that Nichols would never leave a prison cell again. He was sent to the ADX Florence Supermax in Colorado, the place the Bureau of Prisons reserves for those deemed too dangerous or too influential to keep anywhere else. Inside ADX, Nichols lives in near-total silence. His cell measures just 7 feet wide by 12 feet long, with concrete walls, a steel door, and a small slit of a window facing the mountains. For 23 hours a day, he's alone, a man who once declared war on his government, now confined by it. The remaining hour, he's allowed to walk in a concrete courtyard, always alone, under tight surveillance. Reports say he spends his time writing, reading religious texts, and filing grievances against the prison system. He's now in his late 60s and has outlived many of those he once claimed to fight for. Over the years, Nichols has continued to claim that he was a scapegoat, that McVeigh alone carried out the bombing. But federal records, receipts, and his own signed statements tell a different story. The evidence of his hands in the making of that bomb will never fade. In the end, Terry Lynn Nichols stands as a reminder that sometimes the face of terrorism doesn't come from overseas. It grows from anger within. His place in ADX Florence ensures he can never spread that hatred again. Number 2. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Sometimes evil doesn't come with a plan. It's born in moments of rage, in borrowed ideas, and in blind loyalty. When the bombs went off at the Boston Marathon finish line, the world saw terror in real time. But behind those blasts stood a teenager, quiet, ordinary, almost invisible, who had decided to make himself a weapon. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was born in Kyrgyzstan in 1993, part of a Chechen family that had fled years of war and persecution. The family eventually sought refuge in the United States, settling in Cambridge, Massachusetts. To friends and teachers, Dzhokhar seemed like any other American kid. He played sports, earned a scholarship, and joked easily with classmates. He was described as polite, intelligent, even charming. His older brother Tamerlan, however, was different, angrier, more volatile, obsessed with ideology and religion. Over time, that influence consumed Dzhokhar. By 2013, the brothers had grown disillusioned. They believed that America's wars overseas justified violence at home. Online, they consumed extremist propaganda, read bomb-making instructions, and convinced themselves that killing civilians could somehow make a statement. They weren't soldiers, just two young men radicalized by hate, hunting for significance. April 15, 2013 was the day they chose. The Boston Marathon was an annual celebration, a symbol of endurance, joy, and community. Thousands lined the streets to cheer runners at the finish line on Boylston Street. In that crowd, the Tsarnaev brothers placed 2 pressure cooker bombs filled with shrapnel and hidden inside backpacks. They walked away casually, blending into the noise and color of the race. At 2:49 p.m., the first explosion ripped through the crowd. 12 seconds later, the second bomb detonated a block away. In seconds, celebration turned to panic. 3 people were killed instantly, and over 260 were wounded, many losing limbs in the blast. Chaos spread across downtown Boston. Smoke, screams, and sirens filled the streets as police and medics tried to make sense of what had just happened. Security footage and eyewitness accounts quickly narrowed the search to 2 young men carrying backpacks. When their faces were released publicly, the brothers panicked. That night, they shot and killed an MIT police officer, stole a car, and led authorities on a wild chase through the suburbs. The confrontation ended in a firefight. Tamerlan was killed in the exchange, while Dzhokhar fled on foot, bleeding and hid in a suburban backyard, curled up inside a dry-docked boat. The next evening, after nearly 24 hours of lockdown across Boston, thermal cameras spotted him inside the boat's tarp. Police surrounded the area, and after a tense standoff, Tsarnaev was captured alive. On his body, investigators found traces of explosive residue. In his handwriting inside the boat, they found a note justifying the attacks as revenge for Muslim deaths abroad, proof of his radical intent. The investigation revealed the full picture: homemade bombs built in their apartment, videos pledging loyalty to extremist causes, and months of preparation. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev faced 30 federal charges, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction and the killing of a police officer. His trial began in early 2015 in a Boston courtroom, overflowing with victims, survivors, and media from around the world. Prosecutors described a young man who had chosen ideology over humanity, following his brother into destruction. His defense team argued he was manipulated by Tamerlan, that he was just a confused teenager swept into his brother's fanaticism. But the evidence was overwhelming: photos of him placing the bomb, testimony from survivors, and video of his calm walk away moments before it exploded. After 2 months of testimony and a day of deliberation, the jury found Tsarnaev guilty on all 30 counts. In May 2015, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. When given the chance to speak, he apologized, quietly, briefly, but for many, it felt hollow. The pain left behind was too great, and the damage irreversible. Tsarnaev's case went through years of appeals. In 2020, a federal court temporarily overturned his death sentence, citing jury selection issues. But in 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated it, affirming the original punishment. For now, he remains at ADX Florence, held under special administrative measures that keep him in near-total isolation. His communications are monitored, his mail screened, and his contact with the outside world reduced to almost nothing. Inside ADX, Dzhokhar spends 23 hours a day alone in a concrete cell, a stark contrast to the open streets where he once walked freely. He eats alone, studies alone, prays alone. Reports describe him as quiet and compliant, but under constant observation. He's still in his early 30s, likely to spend decades behind those walls, even if his death sentence is eventually carried out. For many Americans, Tsarnaev represents a terrifying modern reality: how a teenager raised in freedom can become radicalized within his own home and turn that freedom into violence. His imprisonment in the nation's most secure facility ensures that he will never again see the outside world, and that his name will forever be tied to the tragedy he helped create. Number 3. Larry Hoover power can outlive the streets. In the underworld of American crime, few names carry as much weight as Larry Hoover, a man who turned a neighborhood gang into a nationwide criminal empire, and who continued to rule from behind bars. Today, he sits in the isolation of ADX Florence, the Supermax built to contain men exactly like him, men whose words alone can still move armies. Larry Hoover was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1950 and raised in the tough neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. He grew up surrounded by poverty, violence, and limited opportunity. By the time he was 13, Hoover had already joined a local street gang. To his peers, he wasn't just another kid. He was strategic, calculating, someone who understood how power worked even on the smallest scale. That instinct would define the rest of his life. In the late 1960s, Hoover and several associates founded a gang that would later become the Gangster Disciples, one of the most organized and feared criminal networks in America. What began as a small crew quickly expanded through discipline and violence. Hoover imposed a strict code: respect, order, profit, and demanded loyalty. The group grew rapidly, feeding off Chicago's drug trade and extortion rackets. By the early 1970s, Hoover's word carried the weight of law in parts of the city. But in 1973, that empire faced its first major collapse. Hoover was convicted of ordering the killing of a man named William Young, a fellow gang member accused of stealing from the organization. The murder earned him a sentence of 150 to 200 years in prison. Many assumed that would be the end of his influence. They were wrong. From behind prison walls, Hoover reinvented himself. In the 1980s, he rebranded the Gangster Disciples as a political and social organization, using the slogan Growth and Development. On paper, it sounded like reform, community programs, anti-violence messages, civic engagement. But federal investigators later discovered that beneath that public image, Hoover was running a sophisticated criminal empire worth millions. His orders, passed through coded messages, directed drug trafficking and extortion operations across more than 30 states. He had become the rarest kind of inmate, one who could command the streets from a cell. In 1995, the FBI and DEA launched Operation Headache, a massive investigation targeting Hoover's network. Undercover agents and wiretaps captured hours of coded conversations linking him directly to gang operations. 2 years later, Hoover and several of his top lieutenants were indicted on federal charges of conspiracy, drug trafficking, and running a continuing criminal enterprise. In 1997, after a lengthy trial, Hoover was convicted and handed 6 life sentences. The message from the court was clear. His power would never extend beyond prison walls again. Immediately after sentencing, Hoover was transferred to ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States. The move was not symbolic, it was strategic. Authorities knew that ordinary prisons had failed to contain him. From ADX, communication is nearly impossible. Inmates live in single concrete cells, eat alone, and spend nearly every hour in isolation. Even phone calls and mail are heavily restricted. Inside ADX, Hoover's influence was finally cut off. He spends 23 hours a day in confinement, with only brief moments of outdoor time in a small walled enclosure known as the concrete pit. Even his few permitted communications are monitored by federal agents. Reports indicate that despite the passage of decades, Hoover remains composed and controlled. A man who once commanded tens of thousands, now reduced to silence. Yet his legacy endures. The Gangster Disciples still exist, fragmented but powerful. Their members spread across the Midwest and Southern states. Some still refer to him as King Larry, a title whispered more than spoken. For law enforcement, Hoover's story is a warning about how criminal power can adapt, evolve, and thrive even behind bars. For the public, it's a chilling reminder that leadership, even in crime, is about more than presence. It's about influence. In 2021, a surprising cultural moment brought Hoover's name back into the headlines. Rappers Kanye West and Drake held a massive concert in Los Angeles, calling for his release, arguing that he had reformed. The movement sparked debate. Could a man who built an empire of violence ever truly change? The answer from the government was immediate and final. Larry Hoover will die in prison. Now in his 70s, he remains at ADX Florence, serving 6 life sentences in near-permanent isolation. Time has stripped away his reach, his lieutenants, and his streets. But the myth of Larry Hoover still lingers. The tale of a man who built a criminal nation from a prison cell, and whose ambition outlasted freedom itself. Number 4. Richard Reid. It only takes a single moment at 30,000 feet to change the way the world flies forever. On December 22, 2001, a quiet man boarded an American Airlines flight from Paris to Miami. He looked tired, ordinary, unremarkable. But hidden inside his shoes were enough explosives to kill nearly 200 people and destroy the plane mid-air. His name was Richard Reid, and that failed act of terror would earn him a permanent cell in ADX Florence. Richard Colvin Reid was born in South London in 1973. His childhood was turbulent, marked by poverty, school expulsions, and petty crime. His parents struggled to manage his behavior, and Reid spent much of his youth in juvenile detention. There, he began searching for identity and purpose, something he had never found in the outside world. In his 20s, that search led him to Islam. Initially, it gave him stability and structure. But as time passed, Reid fell under the sway of radical clerics who turned his faith into extremism. By the late 1990s, Reid had joined extremist circles in London, frequenting mosques known for fiery anti-Western sermons. These meetings connected him to al-Qaeda affiliates operating across Europe. In 2001, he traveled to Afghanistan, where he received training in explosives and martyrdom operations. He returned to Europe a changed man, quiet, withdrawn, and fully devoted to jihad. To those around him, he seemed distant but harmless. In reality, he was preparing for mass murder. On that cold December morning, Reid checked in for American Airlines Flight 63, bound for Miami with 197 people on board. Hidden in the soles of his heavy black shoes were packets of plastic explosives wired to a detonator. Somewhere over the Atlantic, he planned to light the fuse and blow up the plane. For the first few hours of the flight, nothing seemed unusual. Reid kept mostly to himself, reading a magazine, adjusting his shoes occasionally. But as the plane began to cross into American airspace, passengers noticed smoke. A thin, acrid thread rising from his seat. One flight attendant, noticing him fidgeting with his shoes, moved closer and saw what he was trying to do. When she shouted, Reid lunged. Chaos erupted as passengers and crew wrestled him to the ground. A group of men tied him up with seatbelt extensions and headphone cords, while others poured water on his smoldering sneakers to stop the chemical reaction. The captain immediately diverted the plane to Boston, where federal agents stormed aboard and took Reid into custody. Inside his shoes, investigators found explosives known as PETN, a powerful material that could have torn the aircraft apart if detonated correctly. In the days after 9/11, the world was still reeling from fear, and this near disaster struck deep. Security experts realized how close they had come to losing another plane. In response, airports worldwide adopted a new rule. Every passenger would have to remove their shoes during screening, a direct result of Richard Reid's failed plot. Reid was charged with 8 federal counts, including attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction and attempted murder of U.S. nationals. His trial in 2003 was swift and public. When asked to enter a plea, Reid simply said, "I am guilty." He told the court that his actions were an act of war against the United States. His lack of remorse shocked even his own lawyers. At sentencing, the judge delivered a powerful rebuke, telling Reid that his actions had been a cowardly and horrific attempt to kill innocent people. The court imposed the maximum possible penalty, 3 consecutive life sentences plus 110 years, without parole. Reid was also ordered to pay restitution to the passengers and crew he tried to kill, though he had no means to do so. Soon after, Reid was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal Supermax prison in Colorado that houses America's most dangerous criminals. There, his life became one of total isolation. He spends 23 hours a day alone in a concrete cell, eating meals slid through a small slot in the door. Even within that environment, authorities have kept him under special administrative measures, which limit his mail, phone calls, and access to the outside world. They believe his devotion to al-Qaeda remains unbroken. Reid, now in his early 50s, has expressed no regret. In letters intercepted by authorities, he has written that he still views himself as a soldier for Islam. Officials consider him an ongoing threat, not because he can act, but because his words might inspire others. The irony is stark. His bomb failed, yet his name became infamous, his act rewriting aviation security across the globe. Inside ADX Florence, the man once known as the shoe bomber lives in silence. He no longer walks among the public, no longer poses a danger to passengers thousands of feet above the earth. His cell, barely larger than a bathroom, is the entire world he has left. For the families who nearly lost their loved ones that day, his capture was justice. For the world, it was a grim reminder that vigilance never ends. One man's failed mission became every traveler's routine, a ritual born from fear, carried out for safety. Number 5. Eric Rudolph. Sometimes terror hides behind the face of ordinary rebellion, a man who walks among the public, blending into crowds, only to vanish into the wilderness after leaving devastation behind. For years, Eric Rudolph was one of the most wanted men in America. His bombings during the 1990s, including one at the Atlanta Olympic Games, left a trail of death, fear, and confusion. When he was finally captured, the nation discovered that its most elusive terrorist had been living off the land, guided by ideology and hatred. Eric Robert Rudolph was born in Florida in 1966 and raised in the mountains of North Carolina. His family lived simply, and his upbringing was steeped in survivalism and mistrust of government authority. As a teenager, he was intelligent but restless. He briefly joined the U.S. Army, where he received explosives training, but his military career was short-lived. After leaving the service, he drifted into extremist circles, drawn to radical anti-government and white supremacist beliefs. By the mid-1990s, Rudolph had become convinced that violence was the only way to send his message to the world. The stage for his most notorious act was set in the summer of 1996, when the world gathered in Atlanta for the Olympic Games. On the night of July 27th, Centennial Olympic Park was packed with spectators, enjoying concerts and celebrations. Rudolph slipped into the crowd carrying a green backpack loaded with pipe bombs and nails. He set the bag down near a sound tower and walked away. At 1:20 a.m., the bomb detonated. The blast killed one woman, injured more than 100 others, and turned what was supposed to be a symbol of peace into a scene of chaos. The attack stunned the nation. The FBI launched an enormous investigation, but Rudolph had already vanished into the Appalachian Mountains. As the search intensified, new bombings began to appear, all sharing his signature. In 1997, he bombed 2 women's health clinics and a gay nightclub in Atlanta, injuring several people. In 1998, another bomb exploded outside a clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, killing a police officer and critically injuring a nurse. Each attack was driven by Rudolph's extremist opposition to abortion and LGBTQ rights. His writings later revealed that he saw himself as a soldier in a self-declared war against what he viewed as moral decay. By 1998, Rudolph was officially placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, with a $1 million reward for information leading to his capture. Yet despite the national manhunt, he disappeared completely. For the next 5 years, he lived deep in the Appalachian wilderness, surviving on scavenged food, stolen supplies, and sheer endurance. Locals occasionally spotted him rummaging through dumpsters or sneaking through backwoods trails, but he always slipped away before authorities could close in. His capture came unexpectedly in May 2003, when a rookie police officer in Murphy, North Carolina, found him rummaging behind a grocery store in the early morning hours. Malnourished, bearded, and quiet, Rudolph surrendered without resistance. After years of hunting him, the FBI finally had the man responsible for 4 bombings and 2 deaths. In court, Rudolph showed little remorse. He claimed his attacks were acts of defense, not crimes. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty to all charges, including the Olympic Park bombing, and cooperated with investigators by revealing the locations of hidden explosives. In 2005, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 120 years in federal prison. Soon after sentencing, Rudolph was transferred to ADX Florence, where he remains today. His confinement is absolute. For 23 hours a day, he is locked inside a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell. His contact with the outside world is limited to the occasional monitored letter or a brief exercise session in an isolated courtyard. In that silence, the man who once wanted to change the world now speaks only to himself. Even from his cell, Rudolph has continued to justify his actions. He has written essays expressing his ideology and railing against the government. Prison officials have restricted his communications, fearing that his words might inspire others. He has been described as calm, solitary, and unrepentant, a man who believes his campaign of terror was righteous. For investigators and survivors alike, his story remains one of the most haunting examples of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. Rudolph's bombs targeted not armies or governments, but ordinary civilians, people celebrating, working, or simply living their lives. His capture ended a chapter of fear that had stretched nearly a decade, but the scars left behind never faded. Now in his late 50s, Eric Rudolph remains locked inside America's most secure prison. The mountains he once called home are visible from the Supermax, but they are far beyond reach. In the end, the man who believed he could live forever off the grid now lives inside the smallest grid imaginable, a cell built to ensure he will never roam free again. Number 6. Zacarias Moussaoui. There are moments in history when the right question could have changed everything. In August 2001, an FBI agent looked at a strange flight student in Minnesota and wondered why a man with no interest in takeoffs or landings wanted to learn how to steer a Boeing 747. That student was Zacarias Moussaoui, the man who would later be called the 21st hijacker. His arrest came just weeks before 9/11, and his silence helped ensure the worst terrorist attack in American history went ahead as planned. Zacarias Moussaoui was born in France in 1968 to Moroccan immigrant parents. His family worked hard, but life was difficult. Moussaoui excelled academically, earning a degree in international business and later studying in London. He was intelligent, articulate, and ambitious, but restless. During his time in Britain, he was drawn toward radical preachers who blamed the West for Muslim suffering. What began as political curiosity hardened into extremism. By the late 1990s, Moussaoui had traveled to Afghanistan, where he trained in al-Qaeda camps under the supervision of men who would later help orchestrate 9/11. When he returned to Europe, he was a changed man, cold, distant, and convinced that jihad was his purpose. In early 2001, he entered the United States on a student visa and began taking flight lessons at several aviation schools. His behavior was odd. He paid thousands of dollars in cash, had little flying experience, and seemed uninterested in learning basic skills. At one school in Eagan, Minnesota, instructors grew suspicious when he wanted only to learn how to fly large jets, not how to take off or land them. Their report to the FBI may have prevented an even larger disaster. On August 16, 2001, federal agents arrested Moussaoui on immigration charges after the school alerted them. They seized his laptop and other possessions, but due to legal limits at the time, could not immediately search his digital files. Inside that computer were names, connections, and evidence that linked him to several of the future 9/11 hijackers. Weeks later, when the planes hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, agents realized the man they already had in custody could have been part of the plot. In the days after the attacks, Moussaoui was interrogated repeatedly. He offered no useful information, often taunting investigators. Evidence soon revealed that he had trained alongside members of the Hamburg cell, including Mohammed Atta, and had connections to shoe bomber Richard Reid. Intelligence agencies concluded that he was meant to join the hijackers as part of a fifth plane, possibly targeting the White House. In December 2001, Moussaoui was indicted on 6 federal conspiracy charges for his role in the 9/11 plot. His trial would become one of the most dramatic in American history. Acting as his own lawyer, Moussaoui often disrupted the courtroom, shouting defiance and praising al-Qaeda. His erratic behavior swung between delusion and arrogance. At one point, he declared that he was al-Qaeda and boasted about knowing Osama bin Laden personally. Despite his outbursts, the case against him was airtight. The prosecution presented evidence of his training, his communications with other operatives, and his knowledge of the plan to use passenger jets as weapons. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, watching as the man connected to the worst attack in modern history mocked their grief. In April 2005, Moussaoui pleaded guilty to all 6 counts, admitting that he had been part of the conspiracy. During sentencing, prosecutors argued for the death penalty, while the defense claimed he was mentally unstable and not directly responsible for the attacks. After weeks of testimony, including haunting stories from survivors, the jury spared his life by a narrow margin. On May 4, 2006, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He was transferred to ADX Florence, where he remains in total isolation. His cell, built of reinforced concrete, holds nothing but a bed, a sink, and a steel toilet. For 23 hours a day, Moussaoui sits alone, monitored constantly. Under special administrative measures, he cannot communicate freely, receive unfiltered mail, or interact with other prisoners. Authorities treat him as a continuing threat, a man whose words alone could inspire new violence. Now in his late 50s, Moussaoui's years in solitary have done little to soften his views. He has filed erratic lawsuits, claiming mistreatment, accusing guards of poisoning him, and sending strange letters to courts. He continues to express radical beliefs, occasionally proclaiming that the United States deserved the attacks. Yet for all his defiance, his life has narrowed to silence, a small, echoing cell deep inside the Supermax. To this day, Moussoui's name symbolizes a haunting what if. If investigators had been allowed to open his laptop just a few weeks earlier, could the attacks have been stopped? Could thousands of lives have been saved? Those questions linger, unanswered, as he lives out the rest of his days in isolation. Inside ADX Florence, Zacarias Moussaoui remains the final living thread to the 9/11 plot, a reminder of the cost of fanaticism and how close the world came to an even greater tragedy. Number 7. Ramzi Yousef. Before 9/11 shocked the world, another man tried to bring down the World Trade Center years earlier. His name was Ramzi Yousef, a calm, calculating bomb maker whose ambition was to kill thousands and shake America to its core. In 1993, his plan failed, but it came terrifyingly close to changing history. Today, he sits in isolation at ADX Florence, the fortress built to contain men like him. Architects of terror whose crimes echo across decades. Ramzi Ahmed Yousef was born in Kuwait in 1967 to Pakistani parents. He grew up in a privileged family, well-educated and fluent in several languages. From a young age, he displayed a sharp intellect and a fascination with engineering. He later attended college in Wales, studying electrical engineering, knowledge that would one day make his bombs more deadly. But behind that academic drive grew a darker curiosity. During the late 1980s, as the Soviet-Afghan War drew global attention, Yousef's anger toward Western involvement in the Middle East began to harden. By his mid-20s, he had embraced extremist ideology and set out to fight what he saw as America's dominance in the Muslim world. In 1992, Yousef entered the United States on a false Iraqi passport, slipping through airport security with little notice. He wasted no time. Teaming up with a small group of radicalized men in New Jersey, he began planning a massive attack that would, in his words, teach America a lesson. The target, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. His goal was not just destruction, he wanted one tower to collapse into the other, killing tens of thousands in a single strike. On the morning of February 26, 1993, Yousef drove a rented Ryder van into the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. Inside the van sat a 1,200-pound bomb built from urea nitrate, hydrogen gas, and other chemicals, a crude but powerful device he had designed himself. After lighting the fuse, Yousef calmly exited the building and fled in a waiting car. At 12:17 p.m., the bomb exploded. The blast tore through 5 floors of concrete, carving a massive crater underground and sending a fireball up through the tower's elevator shafts. Smoke filled the stairwells as thousands scrambled to escape the darkened buildings. The explosion killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000. Yet Yousef's plan to topple the towers failed. Structural engineers later said that had he placed the bomb just a few meters closer to a main column, the damage might have been catastrophic. Still, the attack proved that America was no longer untouchable. For investigators, it was the first clear sign that a new kind of terrorism had arrived. Within hours, FBI agents began piecing together the evidence. They recovered fragments of the bomb-laden van, including a piece of the chassis that contained a vehicle identification number. That number led them straight to the rental agency in New Jersey, and to one of Yousef's accomplices, who had returned days later to claim a lost deposit. By then, Yousef had fled the country, boarding a plane to Pakistan under a fake name. Over the next 2 years, he became one of the world's most wanted fugitives. He continued plotting new attacks, including the infamous Bojinka plot, which aimed to blow up 12 American passenger jets over the Pacific Ocean. The plan could have killed thousands, but it was accidentally uncovered in 1995 when a chemical fire broke out in his Manila apartment. When police raided the scene, they found laptop files detailing every step of the plan, including airline schedules and bomb designs. Days later, Yousef was tracked to a luxury hotel in Islamabad, Pakistan. An elite team of agents, working with local authorities, raided his room. According to reports, Yousef was sitting on the floor, surrounded by electrical wires and bomb manuals. When they arrested him, he smiled calmly and said, "I am glad it is finally over." In 1998, after a dramatic trial in New York, Ramzi Yousef was convicted of masterminding the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the Bojinka plot. During sentencing, he remained unrepentant, declaring that his goal had been to punish the United States for its policies in the Middle East. The judge handed down the harshest possible punishment, life in prison plus 240 years, and recommended that he spend the rest of his days in total isolation. Yousef was sent to ADX Florence, where he has been ever since. He is housed under special administrative measures, meaning no unmonitored communication with anyone outside his legal counsel. He spends 23 hours each day in his cell, the silence broken only by the sound of distant doors locking. Prison officials say he rarely speaks, never shows remorse, and follows a rigid daily routine. Now in his late 50s, Yousef remains one of the most closely watched inmates in America. He is considered a living precursor to 9/11, the man whose first failed strike showed terrorists that the World Trade Center could be attacked at all. In a chilling historical arc, his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, would later mastermind the 9/11 attacks themselves. Inside ADX Florence, Ramzi Yousef's world has shrunk to bare walls and a narrow window overlooking the Colorado desert. The man who once dreamed of shaking America to its knees now lives in silence, forgotten by the world he tried to destroy. Number 8. Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab. Christmas morning, 2009. As families across America unwrapped gifts and shared meals, a commercial jet from Amsterdam descended toward Detroit with 289 people on board. Among them sat a 23-year-old man wearing a blank expression, whispering quiet prayers. Hidden in his clothing was a small but powerful explosive sewn into his underwear. He was about to change air travel security forever. His name was Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab, and though his bomb failed to detonate, his intentions were deadly. Abdulmutallab was not born into desperation or poverty. He grew up surrounded by privilege in Nigeria. His father was one of the country's most respected bankers, and his family lived in luxury. He attended international schools, excelled academically, and studied mechanical engineering at University College London. Friends described him as quiet, polite, and deeply religious, but not threatening. Yet beneath that calm exterior, he struggled to belong. While studying abroad, he became isolated, and his curiosity about extremist ideology began to grow in online forums. That curiosity would soon be exploited by one of the most dangerous terrorist groups in the world. By 2009, Abdulmutallab had traveled to Yemen, where he met operatives from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a branch known for recruiting young Western-educated Muslims. They saw potential in him, intelligent, fluent in English, and willing to die. He trained with the group for several weeks, learning how to handle explosives and craft a device that could evade airport detection. His assignment would be simple: board a US-bound plane and detonate the bomb mid-flight, killing everyone aboard. On December 25, 2009, Abdulmutallab boarded Northwest Airlines, Flight 253 from Amsterdam to Detroit. He carried only a small bag, smiled politely to the crew, and took his window seat near the back of the plane. Hidden beneath his clothing was a packet of PETN, a highly explosive chemical connected to a syringe detonator. For most of the flight, he appeared calm, reading, praying, blending in. As the aircraft began its descent into Detroit, he pulled a blanket over himself and prepared to ignite the device. A sharp flash lit the cabin, followed by smoke and the smell of burning fabric. The bomb malfunctioned, setting fire to his clothes instead of detonating. Passengers screamed as chaos erupted. One man leapt across the aisle and tackled Abdulmutallab, while flight attendants grabbed fire extinguishers to smother the flames. The attacker was restrained as the plane made an emergency landing. When federal agents boarded the aircraft, they found a charred device melted into his underwear and traces of explosive residue on his body. Under questioning, Abdulmutallab calmly confessed that he had been trained by al-Qaeda in Yemen and acted under their direction. He said he wanted to retaliate for US military actions overseas. The confession triggered a global review of aviation security. New scanning machines, full-body detectors, and enhanced pat-downs were introduced in airports around the world. In 2010, a federal grand jury indicted Abdulmutallab on 8 charges, including attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction and attempted murder of the plane's passengers. During pretrial hearings, he dismissed his American lawyers, insisting on representing himself. In court, he declared that he was proud to be a soldier of Allah. His words sent shivers through the room. He refused to acknowledge the survivors, never apologized, and smiled as prosecutors described the panic he caused. In 2012, the judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms plus 50 years, calling him a remorseless terrorist who will never see freedom. Abdulmutallab was immediately transferred to ADX Florence, where he remains in near-total isolation. Inside the Supermax, he is one of the youngest inmates. Prison officials consider him highly dangerous, not just because of what he did, but because of what he believes. Even from behind bars, he has tried to preach extremist messages to other inmates, shouting through air vents and quoting radical sermons. As a result, the Bureau of Prisons placed him under special administrative measures, restricting his communications to prevent him from inspiring followers. He eats alone, prays alone, and spends each day inside a concrete cell no larger than a small garage closet. Over the years, Abdulmutallab has filed several lawsuits claiming mistreatment, but none have succeeded. Now in his mid-30s, he remains defiant and silent about his past. For investigators, he represents a new era of terrorism. Educated, well-resourced individuals radicalized through the internet rather than battlefields. His failed attempt exposed a terrifying gap in global security, one that nations rushed to close. Every traveler who removes their shoes or passes through a full-body scanner owes part of that ritual to men like Reid and Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab. Their failures became the foundation of aviation safety. Their punishments, life in isolation, became warnings to anyone who might follow their path. Today, deep within ADX Florence, the man once known as the underwear bomber sits in silence, his world reduced to gray walls and a narrow window facing the empty Colorado desert. His attempt to destroy lives only succeeded in destroying his own. Number 9. Abu Hamza al-Masri. Some people don't need weapons to spread destruction. Their voices alone are enough. For more than a decade, Abu Hamza al-Masri used his pulpit in London to preach hatred, radicalize followers, and call for war against the West. His fiery sermons helped shape a generation of extremists, many of whom went on to commit acts of terror around the world. But today, his words reach no one. Inside ADX Florence, the preacher who once commanded crowds now speaks only to concrete walls. Abu Hamza's real name is Mustafa Kamel Mustafa, born in 1958 in Alexandria, Egypt. He grew up during a time of political tension and military rule. As a young man, he moved to London to study civil engineering, and by all accounts, he was intelligent and ambitious. But after years abroad, his life began to change. He became increasingly drawn to religion, at first sincerely, then fanatically. By the early 1990s, he had immersed himself in radical circles, embracing the idea that violence was justified in defense of Islam. A bizarre accident in Afghanistan in the early 1990s left Abu Hamza permanently disfigured. He lost both hands and one eye, reportedly, while experimenting with explosives. After that, he began using metal hooks in place of hands, earning him his infamous nickname, the Hook-Handed Cleric. But his physical scars only seemed to make him more determined. Returning to London, he took control of the Finsbury Park Mosque, turning it into a breeding ground for radical ideology. From his pulpit, Abu Hamza delivered sermons that were part theology, part declaration of war. He praised al-Qaeda, justified the killing of civilians, and encouraged young men to travel abroad for militant training. Under his influence, several British citizens went on to join terrorist groups. His mosque became a meeting place for extremists, including individuals later linked to attacks in the US and Europe. For years, British authorities struggled with how to handle him. Protected by free speech laws, Abu Hamza exploited the system to continue preaching hate. But his actions eventually went beyond words. Investigators linked him to the 1998 kidnapping of Western tourists in Yemen, a deadly incident that left 4 hostages dead. He was also accused of trying to set up a terror training camp in Oregon, and of providing material support to al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In 2004, British police finally arrested him on charges of inciting murder and racial hatred. He was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. But while he served that term, the United States filed an extradition request, seeking to prosecute him for terrorism offenses connected to American citizens. After years of legal battles, the British courts agreed, and in 2012, Abu Hamza was handed over to US authorities and flown to New York. His American trial in 2014 was extraordinary. The jury watched footage of him preaching in London, waving his metal hooks, as he shouted messages of war. They heard recordings of his involvement in hostage negotiations and plans for training camps. The evidence was overwhelming. Abu Hamza was found guilty on all 11 federal charges, including hostage-taking, aiding terrorists, and conspiracy to establish a militant base on US soil. When asked to address the court before sentencing, he remained defiant. He claimed his words had been misunderstood, that he had only been offering spiritual guidance. The judge disagreed. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole and transferred to ADX Florence, where he remains under tight supervision. Life inside ADX is a brutal contrast to the world he once ruled from his mosque. For 23 hours a day, Abu Hamza lives alone in a small cell. He eats through a slot in the door, exercises in a concrete enclosure, and communicates only through heavily monitored channels. Because of his physical disabilities, prison staff have modified parts of his cell to accommodate his condition, but his complaints about isolation have been dismissed. The court ruled that his incarceration is appropriate given the magnitude of his crimes. Now in his mid-60s, Abu Hamza's health has deteriorated, and his once booming voice has grown faint. But for officials, he remains a symbol of the danger posed by radical propaganda, a reminder that words can kill. His imprisonment at ADX is not just a punishment, but a safeguard, ensuring that his rhetoric can never again ignite violence. Abu Hamza al-Masri's rise and fall trace a grim path from preacher to prisoner, from megaphone to silence. He once saw himself as a messenger of divine justice. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, proof that even the loudest voice of hate can be muted behind the walls of America's most secure prison. Number 10. Robert Hanssen betrayal rarely looks like a villain. Sometimes it wears a suit, carries a badge, and smiles at the people it deceives. For more than 20 years, Robert Hanssen lived a double life, one as a trusted FBI counterintelligence agent, the other as one of the most destructive spies in American history. His secrets led to the deaths of U.S. informants overseas, exposed classified operations, and nearly crippled America's ability to protect itself during the Cold War. When he was finally caught in 2001, even his colleagues could not believe the man they worked beside had been selling out his own country. Robert Philip Hanssen was born in Chicago in 1944. The son of a strict police officer, he grew up in a household dominated by control and criticism. Those early experiences shaped his cold, distant personality. After studying chemistry and later accounting, Hanssen joined the Chicago Police Department before moving to the FBI in 1976. There, he worked in counterintelligence, the very division responsible for hunting spies. To his peers, he was brilliant but socially awkward, an introverted man with an air of superiority. Beneath that quiet demeanor, however, he carried a dangerous secret. In 1979, just 3 years into his FBI career, Hanssen began selling classified information to the Soviet Union's KGB. At first, his motivation appeared to be money. His first drop earned him around $20,000. But over time, greed mixed with ego. He wasn't just betraying his country for profit. He was doing it for power. Using dead drops in parks and coded letters, Hanssen passed over more than 6,000 classified documents, including details of nuclear defense strategies, surveillance technology, and the names of undercover agents operating abroad. Several of those informants were executed after Hanssen revealed their identities. To avoid detection, Hanssen operated under the alias Ramon Garcia. He never met his handlers face-to-face, preferring to exchange messages hidden in trash bags and taped under park benches. He would leave instructions using chalk marks on fences to signal his Soviet contacts. Over time, he received more than $1.4 million in cash, diamonds, and offshore funds. Meanwhile, inside the FBI, he was regarded as a quiet professional, the kind of man no one would ever suspect. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Hanssen continued his espionage, this time selling secrets to the Russian Federation. The information he provided compromised ongoing operations and allowed foreign intelligence agencies to track U.S. spies with terrifying precision. His actions, described by investigators as a catastrophe for national security, made him one of the most damaging double agents in American history. Throughout the 1990s, suspicions grew within the FBI and CIA. Intelligence losses were piling up, but no one could identify the mole. Ironically, Hanssen himself was briefly assigned to help find the traitor, a position that gave him access to the investigation trying to catch him. It was the perfect cover, but by 2000, the walls began to close in. A tip from a former Russian intelligence officer finally revealed a voice recording and a fingerprint from one of Hanssen's drops. The evidence pointed straight to him. On February 18, 2001, agents set a trap at a park in Vienna, Virginia. Surveillance teams watched as Hanssen placed a plastic bag filled with classified material under a bridge, a dead drop for his Russian handlers. As he walked away, agents surrounded him. His first words were quiet and almost resigned. "What took you so long?" The scale of his betrayal stunned the nation. In July 2001, Hanssen pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage to avoid the death penalty. He admitted to selling secrets for over 2 decades, undermining U.S. operations and putting lives at risk. The court sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms without parole, calling his actions the worst intelligence disaster in American history. Hanssen was transferred to ADX Florence, where he lived under strict isolation. His daily routine was monotonous, alone in a small cell, reading religious books, writing letters to his wife, and rarely speaking to anyone. Fellow inmates described him as quiet and unemotional, a man who seemed to accept his punishment as inevitable. For over 20 years, he lived in that silence, cut off from the world he had once betrayed. Though not violent, Hanssen was considered profoundly dangerous. The information he leaked had long-term effects on intelligence operations, forcing the U.S. to rebuild networks and rewrite procedures. His actions reshaped how America handled classified material and internal surveillance. Even inside ADX, his presence was seen as a cautionary tale, proof that the greatest threats sometimes come from within. In June 2023, prison officials found Robert Hanssen unresponsive in his cell. He had died at the age of 79, ending one of the darkest chapters in FBI history. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no recognition, only a final note in the record books of espionage. Hanssen's story stands apart from the violent criminals and terrorists who share his prison. His weapon wasn't a gun or a bomb, it was information. And with it, he inflicted a kind of damage that bullets never could. His name now sits beside Benedict Arnold and Aldrich Ames as one of America's most infamous traitors.